What I'd love to do is ask if anyone from the local group has a question. Jim.
So I didn't hear anybody talk about highway freight. We have a lot of trucks on Interstate 95, and they're metered a little bit by rules about what they can and can't do going into Manhattan. So they get stacked up in some ways. We get them parked on the side of the road in Greenwich, Connecticut for hours and hours waiting so that they can make the run into Manhattan. But setting that aside, I didn't hear anybody talk about trucks. You have no trucks. Well, one of you has a port, so I'll bet that guy has trucks.
I can briefly mention. So, I mean, we do have trucks on the I-15 corridor because it is a major goods movement corridor, moving vehicles and goods from the border, from Mexico, up to Riverside and San Bernardino County for the rail connect. Now, we looked at them more as a beneficiary of everything we were doing with the I-15 corridor. We have done some post studies looking at their possible use of the express lanes. But when we looked at how could we improve the overall corridor the most, we could move a lot more passenger vehicles into the express lanes, which would benefit the trucks, than just trying to move trucks over to the express lanes. And one of the customer comments we've heard about why people use the I-15 facility is because it feels safe. So it's a trade-off, but I think we made the right choice.
Anybody else?
We actually, the 95 Express experience is very similar. Trucks were actually restricted from the express lanes for lots of reasons. But again, we've gotten a lot of feedback from our customers that they feel safe in the corridor, a lot less weaving going on. But I think trucks is certainly very important, and it can't be left out of the equation. There has to be some sort of consideration of freight movement. There are lots of things that can be done. You talked about freight vehicles parking along the side of the road. You know, in some communities, there's a real lack of adequate parking for large vehicles, and that's something that I know we're looking at in the Miami area, specifically because we do have problems with inadequate parking in the central business district for freight.
So if I could, I don't want to overdo the truck question here, but from a standpoint, obviously we're a major port and a lot of goods coming in out of Asia and a lot of things going out Interstate 90, which heads out towards Boston. It's been interesting. Our apple growers and people who have high value produce in Eastern Washington say it takes maybe as long to get the suburbs into the port than it does to get to the suburbs. And they're looking at it from a standpoint, can they get their trips there and coming in? So they've actually are coming around. Now their first impression is say, I don't like tolls because the American Trucking Association doesn't really care for that. But there is, again, the value statement. And then you come down to the express toll lane concept. We're actually thinking about upping our weight limits. Right now, HOV lanes have a 10,000 gross weight. And we're thinking about going to 18,000 to allow more of the UPS, FedEx, trucks, high value things to get into that, to be able to use it as going. So those are a couple of thoughts we have on the freight side.
Yeah, I failed to mention that we actually built a tunnel which connects the Port of Miami to the interstate system. So we are specifically dealing with freight movement, but we have made a policy decision that trucks will not be allowed in the express lanes.
Another question from this group?
So the question I had was, how did the situation rise to the level of sort of crisis so that you could actually get permission to spend all the money and make all the changes? I mean, you know, I think in Connecticut we're sort of the frog in the boiling water phenomena, where it's getting worse. It's bad, you know, could get a little worse, and then it gets a little worse, and it gets a little worse. You obviously made huge changes. You spent billions of dollars, and you got people to pay attention. And interestingly, you know, geographically, you're all sort of at the end, the corners of the country. We're sort of in the middle, sort of of this little piece. Did that make a difference, that you were sort of these areas that were sort of really bounded somehow by the edges of the world as we know it? And that, I mean, how did the rest of the states where you are sort of think about all this money and all this attention going into this one little area. I mean, not obviously huge in terms of people and but it's still, you're all from big states and big places, and you're spending a lot of money in a relatively small place. I'm just wondering, how did that grow and become possible?
So maybe,
Go ahead.
okay. The interesting thing is we went from 1991 with no gas tax increase at all. And so these things built up. And with that, and we face a situation on preservation of our floating bridge I talked about. We also have a viaduct that got damaged in an earthquake, and that became part of the, we better do something just to preserve our infrastructure that then allowed the packages to go forward. And without getting too much detail, we amazingly passed a nickel gas tax in 2003 and a 9.5-cent gas tax in 2005, and put before the Seattle voters, the region there, a regional package that failed. And for a lot of our elected officials, the tolling is now the regional contribution. So instead of going to Eastern Washington and say, you need to pay more, or not unlike federally, you know, Montana, you can take care of your own facilities out there. We're basically saying the user is paying their part of this. They're directly paying for it, and that's how it's coming together. And we're not doing anything 100% tolls. It's all a mix now between federal, state, and the user direct charges into kind of a mosaic of funding right now.
A related, did someone else want to respond?
Well, I mean, I can just share, we didn't get to that critical mass point you're asking about. I think it ties in with exactly with what Mayor Gilbert was saying. We explained the benefits of what we had accomplished with the express lanes, but the message was, if we don't do this, it's only going to get worse. So I think once people understood that, we were able to be proactive and move forward. Fortunately for us, it wasn't a big investment to start with the pilot on the I-15. I think our federal grant was about $1 million because it was a closed facility, so we only had to build one gantry and put tolling equipment on one gantry and do a back office. It was fairly cheap, but you know, I think the value in that is paid back itself, you know, 100-fold.
You guys are very grown up, very mature out there.
You can call us old, that's okay.
Woody.
First, thank you very much for coming today. This has been very, very interesting. My question is in the area of political champions. And I'm not sure it's a question for the panel exactly. I'd love to know who the political champions in Connecticut are, but let me ask the panel, if I could, how do you identify, how do you motivate, how do you inoculate, how do you get people, the political leadership, turned on to do something about the problem?
Stephanie?
Well, there are a couple of ways. First, we were unique in that the federal government offered this grant funding. And the first round, California was not successful, or Los Angeles was not successful. So that got the attention of our LA Times, as well as our board. And we found out it was because we weren't serious about pricing. I think what was also helpful, not just having a $210 million grant that we did not want to have to give back to the federal government. It was a huge incentive. But secondly, I think our elected officials understood the challenges. We also are a self-help county. We have 3 local sales tax measures that have been passed by the voters for transportation improvements. And our elected officials knew enough about the transportation funding landscape to know what else is there to try. So they were willing at least to try it. And the fact that it was a pilot and we weren't saying we were committed to it. One thing that was not persuasive to our elected officials, state or congressional or local, was the fact that it's worked everywhere else. They said, we're not everywhere else. That's what they kept telling us, but we're not. But we're not Miami. So the fact that we were able to say, well, what if we just try it out for a pilot for 1 year? And guess what? The legislature said, all right, and we're giving you a sunset date. And our sunset date currently expires January 1st, 2015. So I think that helped.
Can I ask Mayor Gilbert what made you a champion? Or?
Well, I drive in traffic also. I mean, I'm just not. It's you can always just schedule meetings for us at times right around 4, between rush hour in South Florida starts at like 3 o'clock, which is amazing because I don't think people are actually getting off work, so I don't know where they're coming from or going. But you can schedule meetings that time. But then it depends on what you're trying to sell, really, also, because I remember when we did the half-cent sales tax, it was a political campaign, and to get political leaders on board, you essentially had a campaign to go around and talk to the varying communities about how specifically their community would benefit. And so it was this kind of piecemeal thing that you weren't selling regional better traffic. That's not what you were selling. You were selling this was going to work for the people who were coming from Doral and trying to get to downtown. This was going to work for the people who were trying to get from the beach. This was going to work for the people who were trying to go north and south. This is going to work for the airport area. These rapid bus lines, they're going to work for South Dade. And you were selling very specific interest in very specific areas that appealed to the political leaders, that allowed them to actually sell it to their voters. Because remember, ultimately the voters are gonna approve it one way or the other. You have to give them something they can actually sell. It's very difficult for me to go, we're the northernmost city in the county. So it would be very difficult for me to go and say, hey, you know what? We're going to pay this extra money because it's gonna help people in Goulds, which is one of the southernmost parts of the county. That's not something that, and I believe that maybe it's probably worth helping them, but I don't think the people are gonna actually vote for that from my area. So you have to make it appealing in some way. And it goes back to the other thing, showing how it's actually going to benefit them. People act in their own interest most times. Mm-hmm. It's really that simple. Most of us in this room, we act in our own interest. Sure. Most of us don't wake up in the morning and say, let's be altruistic. We do things in our interest. So think of the voters and constituent politicians, the people you're going to convince, the exact same way. How's it going to help them? You can answer that question. You can probably get them to agree with you.
David.
I'll start with a question on transit. I wonder, you all demonstrated significant mode split transformations, significant ridership growth. And I wonder first, if any of you implemented transit improvements prior to the construction so that that alternative would exist as an attractive alternative during construction to set the new behaviors in place, and if so, how did you finance that prior to the congestion pricing revenue being in place? And if your transit enhancement was exclusively related to the introduction of the new facility, as it sounds like some of you were, did you have to offer additional incentives because you're bringing on then a new transit service right at the same time when the auto trip is becoming increasingly attractive and less saddled with congestion?
Who would like to?
I'll start.
Okay.
Yes, we implemented transit improvements during construction. One station we rebuilt. It had outlived its use. So we invested $60 million in a new station. We made station improvements, security, lighting along other stations along both of the route corridors. We did that. That's part of the $210 million grant. I said $140 million went to transit. Of the $140 million, we purchased 60 new clean fuel buses, and the rest were infrastructure station improvements.
And that was all done prior to?
Yes, that was deliberate as part of our plan. We wanted it open at least a year prior to us operating the express lanes. One of the reasons we wanted to do it is, unlike the Miami situation, because of our political opposition, we were prohibited from increasing the minimum carpool requirement from 2 to 3. They were able to increase it in Miami. We were strictly prohibited from doing that. So we wanted the transit improvements introduced operational at least a year before so that we could try to develop some capacity, and also it helped us with the equity concerns. And we saw significant transit ridership increase as a result of those improvements. However, when we turned on the express lanes, we also saw an additional increase in transit ridership, and we implemented the first of its kind, an additional incentive where we could link your smart card to our transponder. So if you're a frequent transit rider on the express lanes routes, you could earn toll credits on your account.
That kind of relates to a question that came from the audience, that how do you attribute the transit ridership growth to cases where the lanes are moving faster? Is it the types of improvements you made, the types of things you talked about, or are there other things that have gone on to help transit grow?
Well, I think for us, it's just the time competitiveness. So by developing facilities like I-15, we're using transit very competitive with the car. And I didn't talk a lot about this, but one of the key things we learned through our experience is our carpool growth on the facility grew a lot faster than fast track or SOV growth. People are smart. People realize they start using the facility. So this is a phenomenon we receive. People would sign up for what we call fast track in California, a toll account. They would start using it, and then they realize, wait a minute, I can get this same benefit for free if I just get a buddy. So we saw a lot of folks who opened account, they were using it quite a bit, and then their usage dropped, and they became carpoolers. I don't think that's any different than folks now looking at transit. So it's about convenience for them. So if I can still get to work in the same reasonable amount of time as I would driving, and now I don't have to drive, and maybe, you know, if you're like me, I don't have to put up with Samuel Johnson in the car every day. I can get on the transit bus. Might be a better choice for me.
I actually, during the break, was talking about exactly this. And so the question is, if the lanes are all operating so much better and you have addressed your congestion problems, why would anyone want to get on a bus? And the answer is because you've made the bus a lot more attractive. So the bus is not the usual bus that, you know, the buses that they bought 15 or 20 years ago. They're large, they have Wi-Fi. Parking in downtown Miami can be pricey, so if you get on a bus, you can avoid a lot of your parking charges. The trip is comfortable. There are fewer transfers. One of the things that we did with the project was eliminate a number of the transfers that prior transit users were subject to. And so you get on the bus, you can text away, you can read the newspaper, you can get some of your work done in the morning, which clearly you can't do if you're driving, or at least we hope you're not doing when you're driving. And you don't have the expense of parking downtown.
Well, and just something else, millennials are just a little different. I mean, they're just the M word, yeah, millennials. They're a little different. They like to be able to be on their iPhone or their iPad, and they like to be able to do things. They're not as hung up on driving as like I was or we were when we were growing up.
Another question from the panel?
So unlike I-84, where we have high volume lanes, we don't have any of those on 95. And we're not likely to get any more right-of-way. When you make the lanes narrower, what happens to the accident rate? People are going faster and they have less space to work with.
Deborah, then Craig?
I'm so glad you asked. You know, there were a lot of naysayers, a lot of folks who just believe that a lane on a high-speed facility must be 12 feet. End of discussion. What we did was we reduced the lanes to 11 feet. And see, one of the biggest causes of crashes along certainly the portion of 95 that we were looking at, it's congestion-related crashes. So when you address the congestion, you eliminate a lot of those problems. We also, you know, when you separate lanes, again, the combination of strategies, you separate lanes, so you have express lanes. Those people are making the longer distance trips. There's less weaving that's going on. You deal with some of the merge and diverge conditions. You implement ramp metering. So you've done a lot of things to address safety. You are narrowing the lanes, yes, but the truth of the matter is 11-foot lane works. It works for us. It used to work for us years and years ago before we widened the interstate to make all the lanes 12, and it works again now that they're 11. You implement rapid incident response strategies. In addition to congestion, another large contributor of crashes are secondary crashes. So it's not the first accident that causes you the biggest problem, it's the 3 or 4 that happen as a result of it. So the more quickly you clear that first incident, the more likely you are to have fewer subsequent collisions. So it's, again, it's that combination of strategies. We did not find the facility to be less safe. We did not see a higher crash rate as a result of the narrowing of the lanes.
Or more severe crashes.
Correct. That's correct.
Experience in Washington?
Yeah, just experience. It's probably very similar to Miami. It is interesting, nationally, 25% of all congestion is accident-related, in that you have that first accident, then a second accident happens. Also, most of those congestion are like rear ends. So going to a 12-foot lane, 11-foot lane, we've been doing it all through Seattle with HOV lanes and not seeing a problem with that, with, you know, looking at that standpoint. So again, better free flow is going to help your congestion. And part of what I mentioned real quickly, some of the European traffic management that we brought in to try to give people information regarding speeds and to slow people down before they get to congestion has helped reduce our accident rates going forward with it. I just want, maybe while I got a moment, come back to the transit question if I can. One thing that's interesting on 520, I mean, we've told all lanes. So it didn't become a choice between which lane you're going to pick. It became, am I going to take transit or not take transit? And again, there, we, in February and in September, before we went tolling in December, we saw ridership go up as more service came out. We also, real important here, if going into something like this, the marketing campaign is very important and getting the word out. I mean, half of what we deal with is getting the information out, how to use it, and that public relation. And that became, what's my choice? Our park and ride lots were full and so forth. So how are you going to get people to? People found a way, and it balanced itself out. And people are basically using that price tool to look at it. At a break, I could tell you a little bit more about some of our Microsoft employees who are very high level income level, very less likely to be impacted by toll rates, but they've also had some interesting behaviors. And their Microsoft connector bus runs that they do are full. I mean, they are very, very productive right now.
So just to be clear, on 520, you toll all lanes the same toll?
We toll all lanes the same toll, but they vary by time of day. So during the peak of the peak, it's going to be higher than the off-peak. And what we've seen is the volumes during the peak of the peak are about the same as they were before, but now they're free-flowing. Where we're seeing some of our diversion is not during the peaks, it's during the off-peaks. People say, oh, well, then I'm making a choice. Do I want to pay the toll or do I want to take the alternate route? And so actually it's been the off-peaks where we've actually seen most of the behavior change as far as routes that people are taking.
I have 2 related questions from the audience. One person said, did you have, or a few people asked, did you have any experiences where people were getting off and using local roads as a result of either the tolling or other things that you did, actually doing something that you did not want to happen?
I think whenever you have people in cars, they're going to do things you really don't want them to do, right? But we didn't have, and this is also a question that was asked at break, we didn't have the kind of diversion. I think when I provide the information about how our speeds increased, a lot of folks are thinking, oh, well, the speeds increased because, you know, a bunch of people diverted off the facility. They did not. Our throughput increased because we're increasing occupancy, but our vehicles per hour per lane remained consistent and, in fact, grew a little. And the reason that happened is because when you deal with things like conflicts and you reduce congestion and you quickly respond to collisions, you're going to have better throughput. So we eliminate a lot of the weave concerns, a lot of the merge and diverge is being addressed through ramp metering, and then you're very quickly responding to incidents, clearing those up. So we didn't see a lot of movement off the interstate. Bear in mind that our before condition was 4 general purpose lanes in each direction and 1 HOV lane. Our after condition was 4 general purpose lanes in each direction and 2 express lanes. So the general number of general purpose lanes and their general configuration did not change. So we didn't see a lot of diversion off the corridor.
And, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, we did see diversion off the corridor. It was expected. Again, we only saw it for the first 2 to 3 months, but the reason we saw it is we changed the way we use those lanes. First, we had dedicated California Highway Patrol now operating for enforcement during the peak period that wasn't there before. So you had violators that were shifted out. And then two, our business rule is that every vehicle, whether you're being charged a toll or not, has to have a transponder. So, you know, when you introduce a new product into the marketplace, you know, you have that curve where early adopters, people need to understand. So while people were trying to figure out what is happening, I missed all the media, I missed all the 600 community meetings, I missed all that, what the hell. They were going to side streets. But we saw that as a temporary condition, and over time, we did see that come back. But I would at least share that that could be an expected outcome, at least during the ramp-up phase.
And Craig, you told all the lanes. What happened?
Well, yeah, two different stories there. By tolling all the lanes on the bridge, we did see some diversion to the other routes. And as I mentioned, that diversion happened during the off-peak hours, not as much during the peak periods going forward. It has been something that we've monitored. It's been less than we forecasted. Our forecasts for traffic and revenue have been really spot on going forward with that. But that diversion, yeah, some of our consultants are here who worked on that. So that's been a question that we've had, which is the reason why we're studying Interstate 90 to say, well, can we rebalance the bridges and things of that nature? But it's also interesting in our Interstate 405 corridor, that 40-mile corridor, our local elected officials are the ones who came to the state and said, you've got to take care of 405 because everybody's diverting off of it. And in fact, if you put tolling on it, what we're forecasting is not people to move away, it's actually attract more people onto it, which is a really hard concept. And one of the add-on slides I had in my PowerPoint that maybe we could get sometime here. In traffic, there's actually a sweet spot, 45 to 50 miles an hour. If you're above that, you got more space than you need. If you're below that, you're now into forced flow, stop and go. And unlike water, you know, where you just force it through, everything stops. So you got to find that sweet spot. And then the other principle that we have, we talked about sustainable capacity, is we've looked at Interstate 405 and we call it lost productivity. If you can get 2,000 vehicles an hour in a lane, and then when it goes to congestion, it goes down to 1,000, you're cutting your capacity in half just by having congestion. No one would run their business that way. When you need it the most, so what you're trying to do is bring it back up to at least keep it free flow at that point. And that's the principle that's in play here. And as we've worked with our executive committees, we've been able to educate and bring that along. Now, if you go out to Joe, Six-Pack, whatever, that's a hard one to get to. But being able to understand that principle, there's that sweet spot. How do you get to that sweet spot?
Matt first and then Woody.
So looking down the road, as it were, do you see the elasticity and the education of people working in our favor or against us? Do you see having to raise the price of express lanes to sort of get the right behavior? And looking way down, whatever it is, the road, what's the impact of Google cars? What's the impact of actually being able to control the vehicles from the system instead of just having transponders and
Want to skip many generations.
Well, I don't know. It's coming quickly.
Well, let's talk about the tolling and the increase.
I mean, I think that's the sustainable nature of tolling, is that you will be able to increase it to address demand. And actually, you need that tool so that you can actually realize mode shift, which is ultimately why we're in the game, because we can't build enough lanes to accommodate everyone who wants to drive alone. So yes, over time, the toll will increase if the market, you know, demands it.
I think it's cool that someone used the word elasticity, so.
They gave me a cheat sheet.
Mayor?
She is definitely our smart person. You know, I think that we have to be able to have it available, but this doesn't exist in a vacuum. Transportation, you know, and it's transportation and just transportation. Eventually, we will hopefully redevelop in a way that people actually work closer to where they live. One of our problems in South Florida is we're very poorly designed. So the people can't really work where they live. But as you see, Miami Gardens, for instance, is a new city. As you see new cities come up, as you see areas become annexed, as you see new development, hopefully we develop smarter, not just as a county, but as a country, so that people don't have to go so far to get to work. And that won't just be, you know, and not just work, socialize, you know, whether it's the movies, whether it's a grocery store. And you just think about the model of a grocery store. Why do you have neighborhood grocery stores? Because you don't want to go way downtown to buy groceries. Well, if you just think about that in terms of everything else, we need to look at our development and figure out and really look at it in serious terms, because that's going to determine, you know, how much oil we need and how much money we pay for in taxes for roads. It's going to determine all of that, how we actually build. It really is, we are connected in ways that we don't acknowledge openly, because when you're talking to the public, they don't necessarily get it that way. But it's a seamless web in those ways. And so when you're seriously looking at policy, you can't just seriously look at transportation policy without thinking about development, without thinking about any number of other things.
Go ahead, Sam.
Well, I mean, congestion pricing, it's our basic economic model, right? Supply and demand. So that's how we price it. So without changes in behavior, toll prices are going to continue to go up. That's the only way you can manage demand. I think when it comes to things like the Google car, it goes back to what, you know, Deborah was really emphasizing. These are all just tools in the toolbox. We need them all to work. You know, we're not going to build our way out of this, so we got to change the behavior and look at other ways to get the most out of what we have. So when you think about things like the Google car, and the previous question about changing lane widths, now we can talk about shortening headways as well, so vehicles can travel closer together. Now we get beyond that 2,000 vehicle per hour. Maybe we get to 3,000 vehicle per hour. But the one thing we do know is we're not going to be able to afford to keep expanding our facilities.
Go ahead. I'm never giving up control of my car.
It's not going to ask you.
She's a Bing user, not Google.
As far as, I did want to talk about, because that was a really good question, and it really covers a lot of areas. One thing that we didn't talk about explicitly was, and I thought of it when you said elasticity, is the toll rate setting policy for us in Florida is managed by the public sector. We don't have the private sector involved in toll rate setting. And there was a lot of discussion there about, you know, public perception and goodwill. And you can have this whole big conversation about elasticity, but we just decided to take that off the table and say it's not worth trying to have the discussion about it. As far as toll increases go, as the lanes in 95 in Miami have become more popular, we have had to address that issue and have gone through new rules and have actually increased our maximum rate. It used to be $1 a mile, and now we're up to $1.50 a mile, and we have an automatic mechanism in place where if we exceed the maximum or we hit the maximum X number of times per month and then X number of consecutive months, and there's kind of like an automatic increase, so you don't have to constantly go out with rule revisions. But I think one of the things, and it's interesting to me because it's kind of nice to know that everyone's having the same problems, is communication of the tolling strategy to the public. And making sure that folks understand that because the toll today is $7 doesn't mean that it's better because it's more expensive. You know, there's kind of this mentality of more expensive is better, but that's not the case here with express lanes. We're pricing to discourage use, right? So that when it's $7, I actually don't want you in it. Please stay out because it's getting congested. So we're looking at strategies on how to improve our communication there, including posting on our dynamic message signs congested, so that people understand you're not going to get the free flow trip that you're expecting because we're pricing it high because we're starting to experience some breakdown conditions. And unmanned vehicles is actually, Florida is actually one of the pilot states for unmanned vehicles. And there has been some discussion, it's very preliminary at this point, but there has been some discussion of actually changing some of the business rules in express lanes so that There would be toll exempt trips, perhaps, for different kinds of vehicles. One of those might be unmanned vehicles, so that you have larger percentages of unmanned vehicles in your express lanes, so that you can actually take advantage of the unmanned vehicle technology and have platoons and all that good stuff. So.
Woody.
Yeah, I want to come back to something that Craig talked about, and that is, how do you get the message across? And I'm not talking about Joe Sixpack here. I'm talking about state legislators.
Right.
Of the counterintuitive. Jonathan's accepted, of course. But the counterintuitive, I would call it counterintuitive, that if you can take 10 or 15% or whatever of the cars off the road, you can go back from, go back towards 2,000 or 2,500 cars per hour going through a lane, whereas on I-95 in rush hour, I think it's down around 600 cars per hour per lane, and sometimes even lower than that.
Right. The process we look through is you've got to be very inclusive, obviously, in this discussion, and hopefully I haven't repeated myself, but on 405 we had an executive committee, we had a citizens committee, and we had a senior staff committee, and you got different perspectives coming from that. And we basically embraced our executive committee of all the elected officials up and down the corridor. They had state elected officials there too. So we had one from each corner, the House, Senate, RDs. We had Federal Transit, Federal Highways, all part of that conversation. And they're the ones that started saying, is there benefits? And they're the ones that started making recommendations. And then from there, it went into a conversation with the legislature itself. If you're not from the area, you're kind of hearing a little bit, and you hear about this tolling, and gee, I don't like tolling because that word, and that's where it's generated from, and I've seen that around. Is that saying this is good for my community, this is good for the jobs, I can meet my growth management objectives, my development objectives with that, became something that really had a benefit, and then that allowed it to go forward. And you gentlemen are the ones who have to deal with the political side of this question, but it is fascinating to me at the federal level. It always was the R's, we're looking at supply and demand, it was tolling is good, and it was the D's are always very cautious on it. We're flip-flopped, completely flip-flopped in our structure there. So it's been interesting, the conservative members would say, I like the tolling because it's going to be revenue and I can see it invested. I know it's going to go to transportation. It's improving it. Whereas the liberal members will say, I like the idea you're getting more out of what you have. I'm seeing the transit investment and I'm seeing greenhouse gas reductions. You start finding some commonality under the umbrella. And that's kind of how I think we've seen success so far.
But I think, if I could, Washington did something really, I think, really cool years ago, and their what do you call him? The secretary, the very top guy. Yeah, right. Their secretary actually issued a challenge and said, how can we communicate this concept of metering? This is a metering concept. How do we communicate this concept of congestion pricing or metering to the public, to the lay person? And they actually came up with a video, which I love, and I use a lot. I used it extensively in the public outreach, where they take two beakers, two funnels sitting over top the beaker, and then two more beakers full of rice. In one case, you take the beaker full of rice and you dump it all in at once into the funnel. And you can imagine what happens. You have congestion. Very few grains of rice are actually falling. Now, you take the beaker that you have in this hand and you kind of sprinkle it in, right? And that rice is just flowing nice, and what happens is you actually get more grains of rice. Yeah. And that is really the concept. It's somewhat hard to explain without that visual effect, and it does sound somewhat counterintuitive, but it kind of makes sense. You're metering the flow and thus able to get more out of your system.
Well, let me ask the mayor, did you come into this right away? Were you bought in right away? Did you have to be convinced? How did it work for you?
Well, I don't want to repeat myself, but I drive in South Florida.
Right.
So it's, I'm my own constituent in that respect. So it was, and I'm more practical about these things. I understand it in a very practical way, that if we're going to have something, I mean, I know it's popular in politics to explain that you can have something and it's not going to cost you anything, but it's just really not true. It's going to cost somebody something at some point. I understand that. It's just you have to measure the value you're getting. So from my perspective, I represent a city that's in the northernmost part of the county. We're largely a residential city. So my residents have to go other places to work. Where are they going to work? They're going, some are going north to Fort Lauderdale, but most are going south to Miami proper, and some are going east. So southeast. How will they get there? Well, they can take 826, going around that curve, it's going to be brutal in the morning. They can take Turnpike, both to get to 95. When they get to 95, they're going to be in a parking lot. That's going to take away time in the morning and also take away time in the evening. So just as a practical matter, when I put myself in their shoes, understanding what they go through, it's easy to understand. And I think the rice analogy was interesting. But I think it was interesting. No, it was. If you think it's cool, yeah, it was cool. I would just say this: if we're all trying to walk through a door at the same time, can we get through it?
Exactly.
You mentioned you're on the Miami-Dade MPO.
Yeah.
That group that board went through a transition as well in terms of opposition to support?
Yeah, I don't know that we actually ever talked about it in terms of opposition to support. When I came on the board, we were all pretty much okay with it. We had resolved ourselves. Now we still hear, we seemingly will do a report every other month about managed lanes, and we'll do these reports and stuff. But we understand the benefit of it to the system, and I think we do a good job as a governing body of looking at that regionally. We understand how it actually is affecting the county. So a lot of times people don't have that perspective, but that's why that's why you have a representative form of government. They might not have that perspective. They have an individual perspective. That's how they're going to vote. That's how they're going to react. But from our perspective, we get to see how the system works together, and it really is a system. And so we have to make decisions based on that. So.
David, did you have another question?
Yeah, a few. I got to figure out which one I want to ask about. I think, I'll stick on the non-auto stuff. Florida, California, Washington, all very strong regional planning states. Washington and California, very strong climate change planning states, with a direct link between emissions reduction targets and regional land use planning. How is congestion mitigation, is it a component of that strategy? Are they linked? Do you explicitly talk about the blueprint, not just as an emissions reduction strategy, but as a congestion mitigation strategy?
Absolutely. I mean, in California, it's a requirement. I don't know if you remember the exact law, SB
375.
SB 375. So all the regional agencies are required when we come up with our regional transportation plan to make sure we include a sustainable community strategy is the new component that we had to start including a few years ago. And that has to show how we're going to get our emission levels for transportation back to 2008 levels. It goes back a little bit, but absolutely it's part of it.
So if I could, our MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization, is called the Puget Sound Regional Council, and we participate in that process with them. It's a four-county area around the Seattle area. They've been pretty bold, I would say. I mentioned that on my presentation out through 2030, we're looking at express toll lanes, and we're looking at new capacity being tolled. By 2040, they're basically looking at all freeway lanes being fully priced. That's a very bold statement, and it's a vision. I'd say it's a marker. It's out there. But how did they get there? They looked at testing highways, they looked at testing transit, they looked at the greenhouse gas issues. We do have a state law that says we have to have reductions and on a per capita basis, and how would we get there? And that was actually challenging to think about, okay, how do you actually get to that objective? It's also, from the standpoint of the funding, we're also in that plan looking at moving away from a gas tax and looking, because again, it's a dinosaur in kind of a couple of different ways, you might say. And how are we going to deal with electric cars and alternate vehicles, and energy of that nature. And that plan then says effectively 40% of those revenues coming from pricing will go to transit. And we will basically look towards sunsetting the gas tax. So again, it's a marker. It's a vision out there. What was fascinating in that vision, 72 members of the MPO, only 2 mayors voted against it. One was a small community who said, I really don't like this tolling and what's going to do. And the other mayor who voted against it happened to be the mayor of Seattle, who said it didn't go far enough. And so it's an interesting place for us to be. I'm not sure how even we will get there necessarily, but again, it's a marker, it's out there. And it really did bring together economic development, land use. We're a growth management state. We have a growth management boundaries. We're trying to protect our rural areas and the Cascade Mountains and of that nature. We have a lot of water quality. We have salmon as an endangered species in the Puget Sound area. So we have a lot of things that are in play with that and trying to bring all that together. So again, very interesting. And we're really at the beginnings of our journey towards that.
And the expressway tolling would supplant the gas tax exclusively, or it would be coupled with a VMT or coupled with sales tax?
Yeah, so that's the other thing that we're coming into. Our legislature has tasked our Transportation Commission to look at what we're now calling road user charge, or VMT. Mm-hmm. And one of the key questions in policy is, how do you transition to tolling or into VMT? How does that then come together? There's a lot of policy work on that. And in fact, as we speak, the Puget Sound Regional Council is forming up a Transportation Futures Committee, and we're going to have a task force during 2015 to look to implementation questions such as that. Even though we have a plan that's long range, and the state, we have a plan to move us forward. They're looking at the questions of equity, implementation, funding, and phasing of that nature. And it's one thing to take a single HOV lane, turn it into a hot lane or express toll lane. It's another thing to have 2 lanes. It's a completely different thing to say you're going to take a facility and put full pricing on it. And that politically, and so we know there's a long road ahead on that, but they also recognize this is our future, and where are we going, and how are we going to go forward with that. And so on the VMT, we're working with Oregon and some other states also on their VMT efforts.
I just, Woody, I'm going to give you the last question from the panel.
Well, I just wanted to follow up. Explain to me how VMT fixes congestion. I think it has nothing to do with it, right?
Well, that's a good question, and I think that's a right-on question. If you're just doing pure vehicle miles travel, it really doesn't. It just is an alternate to the gas tax and collection that deals with the technology questions until you put a pricing component into that, where you have peak hours on peak over-demand facilities, and how does that then address that? And so that's where you get into this question between, as I mentioned, between a road user charge and then the question of pricing and how those come together, and that's part of the discussions that we'll have.
So I wanted to say that I've got lots more questions that I'm not going to be able to get to. These are going to be put on the website under our frequently asked questions, and we'll try to respond to them there. If you have additional questions, please feel free to submit those to the website.